Eu tenho fome de cidadania.
Eu tenho fome de ajudar.
Eu tenho fome de cidadania.
Eu tenho fome de ajudar.
Eu tenho fome de fazer a diferença.
Eu tenho fome de levar esperança.
Eu tenho fome de inclusão.
O Mesa Brasil Sesc RJ agradece a todos que colaboram para que essa receita seja um sucesso diariamente. Juntos, adicionamos o nosso ingrediente mais importante, a solidariedade.
Tenho fome de brincar. Eu tenho fome de batata. Eu tenho fome de tomate. Eu tenho fome de feijão.
O Mesa Brasil Sesc RJ é uma rede alimentar contra a fome e o desperdício, que tem uma receita muito simples: promover cidadania e melhoria na qualidade de vida das pessoas, levando de quem pode doar para quem precisa receber. Uma verdadeira rede solidária que motiva a todos.
O que me traz mais orgulho é saber que o que eu faço traz um impacto muito positivo sobre vidas, né? Um trabalho muito gratificante em saber que vai chegar um alimento sobre a mesa daquele que necessita, daquele que precisa.
O trabalho começa com a ajuda de doadores e empresas parceiras, que repassam ao Mesa Brasil Sesc RJ os alimentos excedentes ou fora dos padrões de comercialização, mas que ainda podem ser consumidos.
O Presunic procurou a parceria com o Mesa Brasil com o objetivo de diminuir o desperdício de alimentos que eram ofertados nas lojas. Então, os alimentos que não têm disponibilidade mais comercial para venda, eles são doados porque eles já são aptos para consumo. Representa um conjunto de ações que fortalece a sociedade, uma vez que a gente doa esses alimentos para a população através do Mesa Brasil, e isso nos apoia, dando mais força a um dos nossos propósitos,
Mesa
que é
Brasil.
cuidar de pessoas.
And this strengthens our
O sentimento que eu tenho
expectations
participar de um
and
projeto como
our
esse,
work
o Mesa
in
no
giving
Campo,
people
é um
support.
sentimento de gratidão.
We take part
Nossa
and
terra, ela é
feel
uma terra que
thankful for taking part
fértil,
in this process.
A gente tem muita comida em abundância, com tantas
It is
pessoas
like
passando fome.
providing fertile soil. We have a lot of food. Then there is food that is wasted.
Que tem sim condições.
Now, we're not referring to bad food that is rotten. We're talking about good food to do away with people's hunger.
Essas doações são selecionadas pelo
Grateful to
controle
be
de
able to
qualidade do programa,
participate. These donations are selected according to quality control. They are wrapped and sent to the registered
Mexer com
entities.
alimento é
The work
muito
is done
importante.
with a
E a
lot
gente
of
sabe que
care.
eles são cuidadosamente separados,
We
que eles vão
know
chegar
that
devidamente
the
adequados para o
food
consumo.
is
Até porque
separated
quando a gente
carefully
faz essa,
and
o
that
que a
they
gente
will
chama de
reach the
manipulação, a
consumers
gente
in an
verifica se o
adequate
alimento está
fashion.
próprio para consumo.
When
Então, a
we
gente
handle
faz
them,
um
we
trabalho
check to see
sério,
if the food
e eu tenho a
is
certeza
apt for
que ele vai chegar à
consumption.
mesa
Our work
como
is
ele tem que
serious,
chegar.
and I'm
Então, eu
sure
sinto
that
muito
the
honrado de fazer esse
food
trabalho.
would
Eu
reach
faço
the table
por
as it must. So I do my part in
O
this
próximo
job
passo é
with
distribuir
pride.
os alimentos às instituições
The
sociais
next step
assistidas,
is to
como
distribute
creches,
the food
abrigos
to
e
the
casas de repouso.
social institutions
Lá,
such
eles
as
são
daycare
transformados
centers,
em
shelters,
refeições para quem
and
precisa,
homes.
reduzindo assim a
There,
condição de
the food is
insegurança
turned
alimentar
into
de
meals
crianças,
for those who
jovens,
need them.
adultos e idosos.
They help people in
Os
securing
alimentos que a
food,
gente recebe, a
children,
gente consegue
youth,
economizar,
and the elderly.
nas compras, gerando uma economia
We
que nos
manage to
possibilita, por exemplo,
save in terms of our
recentemente nós
shopping by
adquirimos
receiving
mesas
these
novas,
foods.
porque a gente estava com déficit, as
Recently,
crianças vinham
we
justamente
were
para fazer
able
as
to
refeições, as
acquire
atividades de
new
estudo,
tables
e a
thanks
gente
to
tinha
these savings.
falta dessas mesas
So
e cadeiras.
we
Então, com a economia, a gente já
really
conseguiu comprar
needed
essas mesas
chairs
e
and
cadeiras,
tables,
conseguimos
and
também
thanks to the
comprar
savings, we
alguns
managed to
brinquedos
buy
que
this
eles
furniture,
utilizam nas
and we
atividades
also
de
managed to buy
recreação.
some toys
Então,
that the
na
children
manutenção da
use in
casa, a
their
gente consegue
recreational
reverter
activities
essa economia
in
para
keeping
diversas coisas.
the
E para temperar ainda melhor essa iniciativa, o Mesa Brasil Sesc RJ leva também ações que promovem as boas práticas de higiene, o combate ao desperdício e o aproveitamento integral dos alimentos, estimulando assim a criatividade na elaboração de receitas e cardápios de baixo custo. São cursos, oficinas e palestras que multiplicam o conhecimento, capacitam os profissionais das instituições atendidas e ainda ajudam a complementar a renda dessas pessoas. Esse movimento integrado ajuda a tirar milhares de brasileiros da situação de vulnerabilidade todos os anos. Um trabalho de equipe que ajuda a acabar com muitas fomes, como a de inclusão, cidadania e desenvolvimento social.
We manage to achieve inclusion, good citizenship,
Eu tenho fome de fazer a diferença.
Eu tenho fome de levar esperança.
I hunger for help. I hunger for making a difference. I have hunger for making a difference, and I hunger for inclusion. Mesa Brasil Sesc RJ thanks all those who contribute to make sure that this recipe is successful every day. We place our most important ingredient in this recipe: solidarity. I hunger for tomatoes. I'm hungry for this, for spaghetti.
Oi, pessoal. Boa tarde a todos.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our forum, our international forum, Mesa Brasil Sesc RJ. You who were with us this morning and are back now this afternoon, we hope you had a good lunch and are well nourished to take part in our talks. For those of you who are joining now, welcome, thank you. We've already had a round of talks this morning. That was great. If you were unable to watch, well, the link is already available. And after this, you can do a marathon and see what we talked about this morning. Now, I think it's important to stress that Sesc is launching the new edition of the book Mesa Brasil Sesc RJ, which is set for the 16th of October. So as from the 16th of October, you can go into the Sesc site and download the book of recipes, with a series of recipes focused on health. They are delicious recipes, and you can also make an integrated use of the ingredients. We wish to avoid waste. Now, we are going to go straight into our next panel on the post-pandemic, a world outlook on poverty. Now, we have with us academics, thinkers who are going to share their impressions and their knowledge with us. I hope you can make full use of this. And now we're going to start with the PhD professor of the University of Sorbonne in Paris, Professor Pierre Salama. We also have with us Professor Sulamis Dain, a PhD, chaired professor at the UFRJ. And then we also have with us Professor Celia Sarnecki, and we also have Professor Ren Ferretti Moraes, and who is from the UN Habitat Office for Brazil. And we have with us our moderator, Professor Dalia, PhD from the UFRH. The world is yours, Professor Dalia. Well, I'm going to share with you my screen. Thank you very much, Sesc, for the invitation to take part on this table with other very great friends and professors. As they say that an image is better than many words, I brought here Peter Menzel, the photographer's Hungry Planet. In 2013, he focused on middle-class families from different countries across the world. And you see here a German family that consumes about $500 a week on food, and an American US family that consumes about $300 and something per week. You see a lot of it is fast food. And here from Kuwait, over $200. A Chinese family, a rich family, because they have 2 children, consumes a little less. And here for a rural community with little food, and the disaster that we see in Chad, $1 a week. So this situation in 2013 has worsened in the pandemic. As the ILO has said, there is a dilemma that has been mentioned by people to die of hunger or die from the virus. In terms of Brazil, just to position us, the topic in the morning was about the link and how disparate the situation we have in terms of hunger and waste. And in the PNAD from 2009, and we see all the way to 2020, we see figures that 77% of the Brazilian population was satisfied, but now we have under 50% of that of the population, and 9% of the Brazilian population really going hungry. So in 2013, it wasn't on the FAO hunger map, and now we're back with 19 million Brazilians who are, and we see that Sesc has this program to try and minimize this. Now, this inequality isn't just between countries, but also within our region. The food insecurity index in the north of the country was above the average, 60% in the north, 70% in the northeast, and the national average was 55% in terms of food insecurity index. The northeastern region presented the highest absolute figure for people in severe food insecurity, 7.7 million, and in the north, with 7.5% of the Brazilian population, 14.9% of the total of people in the country going hungry were there. So if we can now give the floor to Professor Pierre Salama, and he will talk about employment during the pandemic. Professor Pierre, please, the floor is yours. Can you see the screen? Well, thank you very much. So first of all, I'd like to thank Dalia for the invitation and all the people who I know, such as Sulan Dan. It is a pleasure to see you again. Unfortunately, we have to do it through the internet, but I would also like to ask you to apologize. I would like to apologize because I'm going to speak a mixture between Spanish and Portuguese because I'm French. Well, what can I say? It was a bit difficult to choose between Spanish and Portuguese, so I apologize, and I will have to speak a mixture of the two. Now, the matter is quite simple. There is a relationship between the crisis and poverty. When there is crisis, usually poverty increases, and especially extreme poverty. I remember that I wrote a book that was published in Brazil called The Size of Poverty, and it's logical that we have to see if the renewed growth will have an impact on the drop in poverty. It's not that simple, though. In Latin America, we now see that we do have a renewed growth, and unfortunately, we still have poverty. So that is the problem. And it would seem that yesterday's crisis in 2020 is a rather specific crisis. It's not the same crisis as before. It's not a crisis in terms of interest rates or financial crisis, but it is a world crisis that came with a virus. And in many countries, things stopped. So there was a crisis with a lockdown in many countries. So this means that because of this, the workings of the work market or workplace will change. Now, it is important to see 2 points, analyze 2 very strange points that are linked with the appearance of new poverty. during the open crisis last year, what arose was a drop in the economically active population. And another point is that there was a rather very strong point or drop in the informal employment. And with the renewed growth, we have an increase today in terms of formal jobs. But it's also important to see that there is an increase in the underemployed. What does that mean? That with the renewed growth, poverty is not able to drop in an important way. On the contrary, what we can see is that the level of poverty is high. Now, this will mean that to deal with poverty, it's not enough to think of growth, but also in terms of income redistribution to the most poor. If we don't have a redistribution of income, it will be very difficult to have a drop in poverty. Now, in order to give you an example, I'll take two countries because apparently they are totally different. One is Mexico. The other country is Brazil. Mexico, before the pandemic, had a brief recession, a small economic crisis. Brazil was undergoing a period when there was a slow improvement. The rate of growth was weak. And this happened after a major crisis. The crisis in 2014, 2015, there was a major crisis. And usually, normally, between inverted commas, the improvement of growth should come. But unemployment was high and poverty was there. So I wanted to take these two countries for another reason. The first country, Mexico, is a country in which there is a new president called AMLO, López Obrador, and apparently he was a nationalist and also progressive. Now, I think we should place these kind of features between inverted commas. Now, we have Bolsonaro, somebody from the extreme right, and with a minister who is a liberal. Now, what happened during the pandemic is strange in Brazil. The country, or rather in Mexico, the country that was progressive did not have policies to improve public works. Now it does. But during the major crisis, the open crisis, didn't have a program to help the poor. In Brazil, things were different for different reasons, for political things. There was what you call the emergency relief. It's nothing. It is very, very little. Now, it has no bearing with the Bolsa Familia program, for example. This means that probably the drop in the GDP was not as great as in Mexico. In Mexico, there was a 10% drop of the GDP. In Brazil, a lot less. But we see that during a short time, during the emergency relief, the purchasing power of many people, informal workers above all, it didn't show such a drop, a big drop.
So this is something quite strange. The problem is that the emergency aid only lasts for a short period of time. At some point, it will end, and again, once it ends, hunger and poverty increases again. This is supported by the data Dalia showed in national levels and state levels, in São Paulo, for example. So I wanted to discuss all of this, and one last thing that I will say is that it's interesting to see that in Mexico, the President of the Republic has a pretty high popularity rate. 70% of the population, to this day, after 3 years, still supports their president. Now, in Brazil, it's the complete opposite. The situation is absolutely different with Bolsonaro. It's quite difficult, and people are less supportive of Bolsonaro. So, you know, there's this whole political part that we could also discuss, the whys and the why nots, why the president of Mexico is popular and why the president of Brazil is not. It's a whole separate issue. The second point is that in order to go straight to the point, because time really flies, so I'd like to go directly to the point that we're talking about here for the two countries. They need to know two factors: the active economic population and the informal employment situation. Poverty today is very much connected to employment nowadays. This is extremely important. It's not the case of Chad, for example. You showed us Chad. That's a completely different story. In Brazil and in Mexico, as well as in many other countries, workers are poor, for example. And this is a very important detail to understand everything that's going on. We need to know and understand how the job market works in order to understand what is today's new poverty and how to overcome poverty. This implies that the operation of the job market also needs to change. It has to change how it works, either directly with higher wages or indirectly with structural reform. This seems interesting to me because what's happening, and if effectively the crisis today is a completely different crisis from the previous crises, the crisis today actually reveals something that is very important to know, which are all, with all the cultural difficulties that we know about in Latin America and above all in Brazil, knowing that Brazil has had an economic stagnation that has lasted for quite a while, and that can be explained fundamentally by the fact that there is great income inequality. Because if you have an expansion of the economy, and you have, on the other hand, the behavior of employers, who many times will prefer, and I'm not talking about all of them, but many entrepreneurs and businessmen prefer buying financial assets and consuming, and at the end of the day, the investment rates are very low in this country, which is it enough to, or it's not enough to solve the problem of poverty. The poverty in Brazil is an absolute poverty, which means that you could overcome this kind of poverty. It's an absolute poverty, and it's not poverty as you can see in advanced countries, which are relative poverty. Many countries in Asia used to have absolute poverty, and it's not the case anymore. Today, Brazil still has absolute poverty, which is also relative poverty, because that would depend on the income distribution of the country. So I will talk about 2 points. One is the actively economic population, and the other one is informal employment. These two aspects are very much interlinked. The first point, Brazil, if we look at the employed population and the inactive population outside of the job market and unemployment, so people who are in the job market looking for a job but cannot find a job, if we take these groups, so employed, inactive, and unemployed, in 2014, the employed population compared to the total population was one of 56 percentage points in Brazil, or 56% in Brazil. And in the second quarter, during the crisis of the pandemic, this number was only 47%, which means that 10%, a little less than 10% of the population at the age where they can be employed left the job market. So this is something new. This is not unemployment that we're talking about. These are people who are just simply outside of the job market. They're not unemployed. So we have more inactive population now in the second quarter of 2021. It's almost 45%, and it used to be 39% in 2014 at the eve of the crisis that Brazil went through. So this seems to me to be strange. You can't explain this only by the fact that we cannot go out into the streets because of lockdown. We can't explain it solely from this, because this kind of phenomenon also was present in the 2014-2015 crisis and came from crises in the prior centuries, which is this movement of people who leave the job market. In the case of Mexico, it was exactly the same thing. It was even more important, more significant than in the case of Brazil. It was more important to see that people who were leaving the job market, the decrease in this economically active population was 13%. Very important to know. This said in another way, we can simply ask ourselves, what's happening with the unemployed? In 2016 in Brazil, that number was 8.5%, and in the second quarter, it was more or less 8%, which means that it was a significant phenomenon. Was not the increase of unemployment. That's not the significant phenomenon, but this is 8% compared to the total population. If you compare this with the economically active population, then that number is 14% more or less. The interesting case here is that there was no significant increase of unemployment. No, what was significant was the fact that people left the job market. How are these people going to live? This is important because this is where the poor population is. Most of the people who left the job market were actually part of the low-income bracket of the population. And if we look at informality, informal jobs, we can see that we are facing more or less of the same moment. Because if we look, for example, at the eve of the pandemic crisis, all the way to June of 2020, where the crisis was all out, we see that the informal jobs fell from a bit over 15%, and the employed population, the formal people with formal jobs, increased, quote unquote, in almost 2 percentage points. So at that point on, what seems to be important, in my opinion, is that contrary to what they say, or what they used to say a long time ago, including the World Bank and the dominant economists, during a crisis, informal jobs do not increase. The prior thesis was that people were laid off in the formal sector, and these people went out to seek other jobs to survive. No, that's not what happens. They simply leave the job market. And this is an important portion of the population that used to be in the job market. So we have data for Mexico. Professor Salama, I am so sorry to tell you that we have gone over our time. Let's leave Mexico for the questions. How about that? No, let me conclude and we can have Q&A afterwards. I know, but we have run out of time. Well, I'm almost done. We can ask questions later. Let's not interrupt, otherwise we will get confused. I can stop now if you would like, or I can go on. Okay. I'm so sorry because I'd like to conclude, and it's something important because not that many people know this. Dalia, watch out. Anyway, the economically active population, formal jobs, informal jobs. During the open crisis, the economically active population and the informally employed population felt a significant impact. With the recovery, we saw a growth in Brazil and in Mexico of the economically active population. And what increased even more were informal jobs. And in the case of Brazil, and this came out in the newspaper O Valor yesterday, were above all people who are working without formal jobs. In Mexico, people whose job increased were in the informal market and not the formal. So how do you explain all of this? And I ask for another 5 minutes. Is that okay, Dalia? Look, it's 2:47. At 2:52, I will give the floor to Celia, okay? So how many minutes have I gone over? 5? No, you've gone over a lot, actually. Look, I have my watch here, and I did not speak for 15 minutes. I only spoke for 10. I'm so sorry. If you would like me to stop, I can stop. Professor Salama, you know, it's always a pleasure to hear you. Look, you said 15 minutes. If you don't want 15 minutes, I will stop.
Muito que você rompe, etc. Não é um problema de moderador. Você quer que para?
Would you like me to stop or not? That's the question. Let me know, because I did not speak for 15 minutes. Look, let's leave the rest for a question, and let's give the floor to Celia. I really thank you for your talk. Look, I still had something to say that was important, but that's fine. Fine, let's go on to the next person.
Ainda incompleta, faltando que a gente vai ter lá.
Eu acho que deveria ser surrealista. Não quero trabalhar desta maneira.
This is not how I would like to work. You've interrupted me, and I cannot, speak in this way with constant interruptions. Okay, I'm sorry. Let's give the floor to Professor Celia Kirstenetsky, please. Go ahead, Professor Kristinetsky. Dalia, I can give Professor Salama some of my time. Is that okay?
Sua lista fala assim, muito bem. É melhor?
Célia, por favor.
Eu abriria
Célia,
a mão
please go ahead.
para poder concluir a apresentação
I would
dele.
like Professor Salamat to conclude his presentation, and I can speak for fewer minutes, if that's okay.
Bom, vamos lá, gente. Vamos, olha só.
Okay, everybody.
É que depois
According to SESC's procedures, that after each person's presentation, I can ask one question, and this question gives the opportunity to conclude your talk, which is exactly what we were offering to Professor Salama. We're still going to hear everything he had to say as soon as we give him the opportunity to ask our questions. So I'm going to give the floor to Professor Salia, and then we will give Professor Salama the opportunity to conclude. Thank you. Can you see my screen? Yes. So my talk will be very brief so that we can have time for Professor Salama to conclude his reasoning, because it was very important, and to me it was very clarifying. I'm going to present something very simple. This is recent data on inequality, poverty, and social politics in Brazil after the pandemic. I'm going to try to put all of this information within a broader historical context, and I will try to present a political hypothesis for the development that we've observed of the inequality and poverty in Brazil. It's just a thesis, it's not proven, but it's just for us to talk about it a bit. And I'm going to present the history. First of all, inequality and poverty, the experience in Brazil, and the political hypothesis, which is my attempt to explain this inequality. Let me try to minimize my screen, one moment.
Não consigo ver. É em cima que tem uma coisinha que diminui, mas eu não consigo achar aqui.
Sorry, I can't see. Right, here goes. So, now this would be what I talk about, inequality, poverty, the Brazilian experience with recent data. I'm going to talk about this hypothesis that I'm going to talk about here, the political hypothesis to show why these indicators. I'm going to talk about the role of the social policies, also the item that I call Social Brazil Post-Pandemic, the social policies post-pandemic, and something very brief at the end. Now, I'm going to talk about the historical evolution of inequality and poverty in Brazil. In 3 decades, we see the income evolution and inequality in Brazil since 1982 all the way to 2009. And so we see this kind of evolution. There's stability in the inequality till the 90s. This is the outliner. The very high inflation in 1989, then the collar plan, and here probably the rich started not stating their full income in their income tax returns. And here we see stability, Gini that was at 60 till about 2000, 2001, and then a drop in the Brazilian inequality from 2003 all the way to 2014. The data here go to 2009, but I'm going to show you a slide on further details, and you see that the drop goes on till 2014. Similar evolution with the poverty and extreme poverty indicators in Brazil. Here we see data for 2 decades, starting in the 90s. We see the drop in poverty and extreme poverty. This is significant all the way to 1995. Well, then we have a stability in poverty, even with the Real plan. And from 2003, once again, we see a drop in poverty and in extreme poverty in the country. When we look at the more recent data, here we see data from 2012 to 2019. 2019, a year before the pandemic, we observed this behavior drop in inequality till 2014, stretching to 2015, and as from 2015, inequalities increased and increased and increased. The same thing happens with the incidence of poverty and extreme poverty. Here we see a drop till 2014 and an increase till 2019 here, both in terms of poverty and extreme poverty. Now, I would like to present a little bit about an idea that I call a political hypothesis. In a crisis and a recession, we have a broadening of the social issues in Brazil. We've always seen that, but we see the answers are provided in the policies. Now, I'd like to try and link the inequality indicators with the evolution in the political regime and the coalitions in Brazil. Now, I have here a table that produces data from the census in 1960, 70, 80, 91, 2000, 2010, and there are data, presumed data for a census that should have taken place in 2020. So the Gini, the growth rate, and the political regime. What I observed was that the Gini evolution has a lot more to do with a change in political regime, and not actually so much with the growth rate. Now, I take the 1970 census as a portrayal of the situation of the previous decade. We had a great growth in Brazil, but inequality increased a lot, and there was a dictatorship. And then I look at the 1980 census and I see a portrayal, a presumed portrayal of what probably would have should have happened or did happen rather in 1970s, an increase in inequalities also under the dictatorship. And then in 1991, I have a resumed portrait of what happened in the 80s. The 80s, a stagnant decade, and I have an increase in the Gini from 60 to 64. So with the growth, without growth, the Gini increased in both cases. And now in the mid-1980s, we had a redemocratization. And with the beginning of democracy, well, in the census, 2000 census, we have a portrayal of the 1990s. And we see the impact, presumed impact of democracy on inequalities, the first drop in inequalities since 1960. So 3 points in the Gini index. Now, in the first decade in the 21st century, I see in 2010 in the census a summary of what happened in the previous decade. A reasonable growth, not an incredible growth, 4% a year on average, and a drop in the inequalities, very significant, over 10%. Between the two censuses, 2000 and 2010, from the point of view of the political regime, democracy, and a center-left coalition, focusing more on redistribution policies. In 2020, we observe an increase in inequalities measured by the Gini. There wasn't a census, so this is just presumed from different tables, but all the tables that I've seen have shown that inequalities have been above and beyond the historical figures. Now we have stagnation in terms of growth, and in terms of political regime, we have a democracy, but a right-wing coalition after 2016. This is basically to understand what is behind the evolution of these indicators. No, none of these hypotheses were checked in economic, measuring economic factors, but it sounds reasonable, though. Now, in terms of political hypothesis, we are talking about a coalition that focused on, in the past, on redistribution policies till 2015. We see that this had an impact on bringing down the inequalities and poverty. Now, after the government takes in direct taxes and redistributes, poverty dropped. Poverty drops. Now, in Brazil, till 2015, we had a very active social policy that brought an never seen before drop in the reduction in poverty, 8 points of the Gini index, and the extreme poverty as well. And now we had Bolsa Familia, we had different programs, relief programs for the redistribution were taken up, and these were implemented successfully in terms of bringing down inequalities. I'd like to say that this drop that I'm showing here and this inequality that I mentioned has to do with an employment survey. And now we are not talking about the concentration at the top of the pyramid in terms of employment. Now, from, well, 90, in terms of 90 to 99% of the population, we had a drop in inequalities. There are lots of studies that show that this is linked to redistribution policies, linked to the left-wing policies. As from 2016, we have a withdrawal of the fiscal policies with a ceiling on expenses, and also in terms of labor reform, work becomes a lot more precarious, and we have a return of poverty and inequalities. And this shows the evolution of social expenditure in Brazil in terms of the GDP. Here in here we see the different times and the evolution of the social expenditure as a percentage of the GDP in Brazil after the 90s, and we have an increase in social expenditure, and this has to do with the social policies that I mentioned before, improving the minimum wage, and all the different constitutional benefits are linked to the minimum wage, so there is a causal reality here. Now, here we see the impact of social policies in a more detailed way. We take, for example, the Gini. In 2009, the Gini was at 0.58, and after income tax, it drops to 0.56. There's a drop in the Gini. And after governmental transfers, pensions, Bolsa Familia, all sorts of social welfare, we have a drop in the Gini. And the inequalities increase here when you take in indirect taxes. Unfortunately, our tax burden is based on those, and this really impacts the redistribution. Now, when we take in the transfers for social expenditure in health and education, we have a drop in inequalities. So we see how social policies are important for bringing down inequalities, and we can't really do away with those. With this scenario, at least for the next, and also for the next 20 years, with the amendment to the ceiling in expenditures, there will be a drop in social expenditure for the next years. We know it will drop to about 13% of the GDP, coming from 20% of the GDP. This is just for the federal government expenditure. So we see that there is a dismantling, effective dismantling in terms of social policies and in redistribution to reduce poverty and inequalities. Here, this table summarizes the Brazilian framework post-pandemic, in post-pandemic terms. Professor Salama talks about the Inca and how the rich recover, but not the poor. We have a loss of 10% of average income in Brazil. So the poor have been most affected. There's been a loss in the average income of the 50% that are most poor. Their is relief, but restricted relief. The incidence of poverty in 2021 is higher than 2019. We have the poor unemployed that increases to 36% after the pandemic. And in terms of the most poor, there's hardly been a change. We see all the different data in terms of poverty and social progress. Social progress, basically, there has been a social regression in 2021. Now, to complete the situation, the inequalities of wealth increased a lot in 2020. In less than a year of the pandemic, the wealth of 53 Brazilians amongst the 100 individuals that are the richest in the world increased by 55%. In the health area, there's been a positive variation of 134. The wealth accumulated by the most rich would be enough to vaccinate the whole world population. Now, I'm showing you what's happening here in terms of the work in revenue inequality and the Gini index. We see with the pandemic a great increase in the inequality. Here, there was relief and then a drop in the emergency relief, and the level of poverty, even in the most optimistic scenario, will be higher than any moment before the pandemic in any historical moment. The same happens in terms of the poverty. We have a drop till 2014, and after 2014, poverty increased. This trough here is the emergency relief that might have been factored in by the federal government, but it was an initiative of the civil society with Congress that managed to achieve this result. Here we had a drop in the emergency relief package, and here we have the suspension of the relief and then the return of relief with less people being eligible. And the ratio of poverty here is higher than at any moment before. Now, this is just to close or nearly close. I have another 2 slides. I hope to be within my allotted time. This is a portrait of the racial inequality within our social inequalities. We have a group of white persons and black persons here pre-pandemic, black women in a worse situation. This is in terms of extreme poverty. So black women in terms of extreme poverty have a worse situation than anyone else. Even with the emergency relief post-pandemic, we have a worse situation than ever. 12% of black women are in extreme poverty. Worse than black men, and a lot worse than the group of white people who have also done worse. This is the evolution of wealth concentration in Brazil. It's very high, then it dropped slightly in 2010 in the period of income redistribution measured by PNAD in terms of work revenue, but also different aspects as well. The wealth concentration increased, and there was a slight drop here, but during the pandemic, there was recovery, and we have the greatest wealth concentration ever since Credit Suisse started measuring this indicator. Brazil, in the post-pandemic era, we have inequalities well as never before. Now, Professor Salama mentioned that there's an extreme concentration of wealth, and there are different structural factors that there's been recession and unemployment after 2015, and we also have the fiscal situation and the labor situation, and now we have the health crisis, which makes inequalities worse and create opportunities for new inequalities and creating a situation unseen before in terms of wealth concentration. And there is an undoing of social policies and also state opportunity or possibilities. Now, this is to give you an idea of the social policies post-pandemic era. So everything that worked before, that happened before, can happen again. So minimum wage without readjustment, Bolsa Familia with a Q, different effects in terms of the taxation, and the attempt to constitutionally unlink and privatize health and education. And this is already occurring. Now, not to wrap up in a very sad light, we can say that the future can be different. We have new paradigms in the world. So, for example, corporate progressive taxes are being advanced. The US is is advancing this, and the OECD is also discussing this. There's an agreement in the G20 about the importance of the different taxes, the forms of taxation. And in Brazil, there is a lot of support for redistribution measures. 86% of Brazilians believe that income distribution is unfair. The average in Latin America is 81%. 74% believe that they are governed by the interests of small and powerful groups. So Brazilians believe that the situation is untenable. Now, this gives us expectations, and the Green New Deal can be a source of inspiration, and other things as well. The idea of an upturn based on public investments in universal social services. Thank you very much. I hope not to have gone beyond my time.
Thank you very much, Professor Celia. You were very clear and kept to your time. I would like to thank you, and you gave us an excellent overview of the situation of poverty and income distribution in Brazil. I'd like to give the floor to Professor Sula Misdain. You are muted, Professor. You are still muted.
Já estou com voz.
Okay, I am unmuted now. I would like to thank SESC for the opportunity, Professor Dalia for the invitation, and I'd like to greet my colleagues, Pierre Salama and Celia Herstanetsky, for the excellent presentations. I am glad I am last because my topic is a bit narrower in terms of what I'd like to say, which is talk about the relations between COVID-19 from the poverty point of view and social fragility as a whole. First of all, I'd like to cite Professor Stiglitz, who says COVID-19 was not an equal opportunity virus. It actually selects people with bad health and people who have more exposure on the daily basis. This means that COVID chooses the poor people exclusively, but not exclusively in poor countries. And I say this because this differentiation occurs in advanced economies, as is the case of the United States as well, where inequalities are great. Access to healthcare services are not unconditionally guaranteed to all, which is one of the reasons why the United States has such a huge number of deaths and is comparable to indices in the developing world, and it offers large levels of inequality in health. So obviously it's not just a matter of poor countries, but it has to do with all countries with poor people. Unfortunately, though there was great inequalities before the pandemic, COVID-19 has two roles now. It has the role of exposing these inequalities, and in a post-pandemic world, we can see we might live even worse inequalities without the presence of new paradigms and new policies. I say this because, first of all, COVID-19 is not going anywhere too fast. It's not going to go anywhere fast because the fight against COVID is not the same in every country. There is no global solidarity that allows the vaccination system to be transferred to those countries without purchasing power and without production power to the vaccines, and without the capacity to fund the populations that are temporarily away from their working activities. On the other hand, from the medical point of view, COVID is a process that does not stop with a short-term cure of the disease, because there are symptoms that are related to long COVID and that heavily affect demands on the health system. In countries where there are no public health systems or universalized health systems that cannot ensure even basic healthcare access to its populations, the poor population will be excluded from the work market based or due to continued health problems. So it's a non-health solution that is aggravated with COVID-19. Before the pandemic, 10,000 people were dying every day due to lack of basic health services, and 100 million were thrown annually to extreme poverty levels because of lack of health expenditures. Only few countries spent the basic resources recommended for basic care, and all this was aggravated by the pandemic. And in addition, there's been a monopoly of vaccine production and distribution, which also revealed in most cases a lack of universal health systems, insufficient funding, and insufficient actions and health services. And without solidarity and international aid, the disease will take longer to be resolved. The second point that I'd like to mention is that actually, just to mention a bit about the macroeconomic crisis and macroeconomic employment, the ILO's forecasts say point to the risk of COVID-19 leaving the job market with greater inequality, more poverty, and fewer decent jobs. So the forecasts in the report Trends for 2021 show that the employment deficit in the global crisis will reach 75 million in 2021, or even before, if we don't have actions to combat the pandemic. So the deficit in terms of loss of worked hours and loss of employment, 100 million full-time jobs in 2021, 26 million full-time jobs in 2022. Therefore, all of this adds to the persistent unemployment levels, underuse of skilled labor, and precarious labor conditions. And all of this reduces in a reduction of income, work, and an increase of poverty. COVID has affected more harshly more vulnerable workers and therefore exacerbated pre-existing inequalities. The general lack of social protections, for example, among the 2 billion workers in the informal sector all over the world, means that employment crises related to the pandemic had catastrophic consequences to the subsistence and income of families. So dealing with COVID is not just a health issue, but also has to do with creating opportunities to change paradigms, to shift paradigms in the policies that will bring back and reshape economic growth and restructure the industry in the productive chains. I won't speak too much more about this, but I'd like to mention the medical aspects as well, and the ethnical, racial, and socioeconomic differences that therefore impact more heavily the poor population. My core thesis is that there's a nefarious relationship between COVID-19 and the poor brackets of the population. We can see from the scientific research studies done on health and COVID, reinfections, hospitalizations, and mortalities, these levels, these rates are disproportionately higher in minority groups, be they ethnic, racial, or low-income segments of the population. In England, for example, in the UK, you have the risk of dying, or the probability of having COVID with a negative outcome is 70% against 20% of the rest of the population, so 70% for minorities. And this taking into account that in England, there is a universal healthcare system. Studies in the United States show that Blacks, Latinos, and indigenous populations are underrepresented among patients diagnosed with COVID with worse outcomes as compared to white individuals. And issues are only equal, and then these differences disappear when studies compare people from the same income levels with access to the same health services with the same comorbidities. So from that point of view, the ethnical and racial differences make no difference. However, if we consider that Black people are more subject to hypertension and cardio and heart disease as a whole, which is medically proven, then we see that comorbidities are also differentiated according to minorities. Another important point to address is that COVID-19 attacks more according to housing conditions and work-related conditions. So workers in the front lines, such as cleaning services, traffic, food, family service, all of this showed that 75% of people who are working those jobs are Black, are people of color, and more than 50% are foreigners, and 8% were living under the level of poverty, which was officially defined in the United States. Therefore, this shows that, or shows how the problem is one of health, which discriminates among rich and poor populations inside a country and also between countries or among countries. I'd also like to call the attention to the long COVID characteristics. During the pandemic, we saw exhaustion systems among healthcare professionals, patients complaining of symptoms for long periods of time, even after COVID disappears and after antibodies disappear. 1/4 of patients present chronic fatigue. Several patients need treatment against neuropsychiatric manifestation, and a large number of patients suffer from pulmonary complications and acquire fibrosis and perhaps permanent sequela. Many COVID patients also suffer from heart disease damage and need long-term healthcare treatments. 40% of patients going to the ICU suffer with kidney failure and need hemodialysis during and after hospitalization. So if my point actually is that COVID treats the rich and the poor differently and attacks preferentially the most fragile populations, these long-term consequences will also be present in the poorer world population. Just to conclude, I'd also like to talk about Brazil. Celia already talked a lot about Brazil, fortunately, of all of the issues that have to do with the aggravation of poverty, and I'd only like to highlight issues that have to do with healthcare. As she said, when you assess through family income, you see inequalities fall significantly based on expenditures in health and education. So when you cut education and health expenditures, which are being attacked by the current administration and are constitutionally limited by a ceiling cap rule, then you're going to significantly increase inequalities. Also, I'd like to highlight the dismantling of the national food security structure created in 2006 and dismantled in 2016. I'd also like to highlight the fact that the income transfer program, conditioned income transfer program, Bolsa Família, had a significant impact on the improvement of health of children and families, because children had to, by a compulsory order, frequent schools and health centers. So what's happening now is that with the exclusion of COVID-19 vaccines, a vaccine system has been abandoned, a system which used to work magnificently well for a long time. And you also have a dismantling of the program called Bolsa Familia, the income cash transfer program that aggravates this inequality. In terms of emergency aid, the government is characterized with an internal fight against the populism and an anachronic situation that exists nowhere else but in Brazil. So more than half of the population in Brazil last year used to coexist with some kind of food insecurity level, and 19 million people were hungry. Actually, what happened internally during the pandemic in terms of Brazil was that you have this confrontation between an absolutely affirmative policy and a highlight of the importance of our unified healthcare system in the process. Though Brazil was late with its vaccination programs and faced great resistance with, daily lockdown strategies. Despite all this, because of a specific aspect of the Brazilian federalism, governors took the forefront and were able to somehow develop both in the vaccination programs and with the necessary isolation measures, and even in local income complementation measures. But since Brazil is essentially a very unequal country, you can see that from comparing the north and northeast to the rest of the country, you have unequal impacts as well, because the governments and the capital cities were able to implement stronger vaccine strategies than other municipalities around Brazil. So you go from one extreme, where you have on average 91% of Brazilians over 18 years of age have received the first dose of the vaccine, and 53% of those also 18-year-olds or older have received the 2 doses or a single dose. But in the state of Amapá, only 15% of the population have their vaccine schemes completed. So on one side, you have a movement that reaffirms our universal healthcare system, and it's made feasible with extraordinary funding, but it has very negative forecasts, because once the government has raised its expenditures with health because of an emergency measure in 2021, this year, the extraordinary expenditures, 42 billion, which were 42 billion in 2020, this year, the amount fell to 25 billion in additional expenses in the health ministry and other areas. And at the end of this year, in the extraordinary budget, could reduce 20 billion reais in reduction of expenditures to the public health system next year and in the years to come. And with that, the budget to buy vaccines and the fight against the pandemic was reduced to 7.21 billion. So when you compare this with the pressure that occurs on the poor segments of the population and with the difficulties of having access to basic health care, you see that funding is a decisive factor towards future exclusions, which is the forecast or the prognosis I make if this scenario isn't reverted. If this doesn't change, the country will miss a great opportunity to decreasing inequalities in health and income, and in the long-term fight against poverty in the country. International experiences show us new paths. From one side, countries that have consolidated social policies and not timid policies as Brazil has had in the last period, these countries were able to give answers through automatic stabilizers and were able to fight poverty and thus decrease inequalities and the negative impacts of COVID, because part of this is a universal healthcare system. But from the point of view of reactive policies, we also see that all of the multilateral institutions and conservative governments abandoned their practices and are now practicing an injection of resources which is significantly greater, such as the United States, and are even drafting an industrial policy that is based on environmental change, and that the idea that already existed in Brazil, which is the industrial complex of the health sector, will be reproduced in the review of the productive chains and in the exploration of health and educational services as a way to bring more dynamics to the economy. So international experiences show us a positive path. And it's important that Brazil, with changes in its governments, can be part of this movement. That is my hope. Thank you, Professor Sulamis. We now have Raine Ferretti, who sent us a message. Raine, you have the floor.
Obrigada, professora Dália.
Thank you, Professor Dália. I'd like to start by thanking SESC and Professor Dália for the invitation to take part on this roundtable. I'd like to also say to all the people who spoke before me that it was extremely interesting to hear you. I'm going to try and contribute by talking about the cities. I work for UN Habitat, the UN Program for Human Settlements, and our mandate is to work on urban topics, things that affect life in cities and also in urban areas. Well, the UN has worked with long planning cycles every 15 years. From 20 to 2015, we had the Millennium Cycle, the Millennium Agenda, the Millennium Development Goals, and the countries agreed on 8 major goals that should be reached by 2015. There were 8 goals. 18 goals rather, 8 objectives and indicators to monitor the reaching of the goals. These objectives represented the challenges at the turn of the century, that countries should make an effort to try and reach the goals in terms of extreme poverty, hunger, gender equality, environment, etc. Now, when we look at the human development map for Brazil, if we compare the years, we see that the index can be very low or low. And if we compare it from 20 to 2010, we see that the HDI improved a lot. We start having lots of municipalities with an index that's very low and started having many with medium and average and high. A few high, but some with a high HDI. Now, many people link the two together, the Millennium Agenda with the increase in the HDI, in the Human Development Index. Now, of course, this might be an indicator of, because there is a common outlook, paths. The agenda we could say, offer some guidelines. As from 2015, the countries needed to renegotiate how to replace the Millennium Agenda within an integrated approach, a more integrated approach. Before the Millennium Agenda, there were 2 focuses, one on the social and another on the environmental dimension. Now we needed a more integrated agenda, and this has now become the 2030 agenda with 17 objectives known as the SDGs. Now, if we compare it with the previous one, we had 8 and now we have 17, and this reflects a world that is much more complex. When we refer to development, improvement, improvements in quality of life has become much more complex. Sustainable cities, inclusive green cities and towns. Well, when we talk about this, we need to think of new topics, and that is why new topics are on this integrated agenda. We have 17 goals with 119 points, or so 169 points that we need to use to monitor how we are getting on in terms of the objectives. These objectives are around 5 Ps: people, prosperity, peace, partnerships, and planet. And these are interlinked. If I move forward in terms of water and sanitation, then I will automatically improve the health SDG, the one to do with sustainable communities and towns, the infrastructure SDG, the ecosystem SDG, the climate change objective. So these are totally linked, and this agenda has a main principle: not to leave anyone behind. And this principle makes us think about not, in fact, leaving anyone behind, but also makes us think of the things beyond the statistical averages. In other words, when countries report to the United Nations General Assembly or other UN bodies, they make reports in terms of meeting the goals in the national territory. And SDG 11 tries to overcome this problem and bring data in terms of the towns and cities. And the professor who spoke before mentioned how the data is different for vaccine coverage in different regions of Brazil. So this principle, not leaving anyone behind, invites us to go beyond the statistical averages, beyond the 2030 agenda. We have another major international agenda related to urban sustainable development, which is the new urban agenda that was adopted in 2016 as a result of the conference, UN conference on habitat and sustainable development. It is a conference that is part of a cycle of conferences that is held every 20 years by the United Nations. Well, the objective is to look at the advances in terms of the 20 years before and work on the persistent challenges on the agenda and the new ones that have arisen for the next 20 years, bringing together principles and strategic actions that should be adopted by governments, society, and universities, companies, and all the institutions that are involved in terms of urban policies, with the aim of thinking of the of urbanization and the phenomenon itself and how we live in our cities and towns. Now, to talk about cities and towns today, most of the world population lives in urban centers. Between 2010 and 2050, the world will have another 3 billion people living in towns and cities. We have the greatest GDP, global GDP produced in cities, nearly 80%. We have concentration of jobs. We know the renovation, cultural renovation centers, opportunities, but we also have many challenges in towns and cities much before the pandemic, such as inequality that was dealt with in this panel. We live in the most unequal region on the planet, Latin America, and these inequalities are growing, and we can see them in our territory, in our towns, in the urban areas. We have insecurity, violence. We see with COVID-19, there's an increase in violence against women. Many women are at home because they're working from home, or they've lost their jobs, or they're studying at home, and very often they have to live with their aggressors, and violence against women and girls has increased 40% in urban areas. Now, resilience has become notorious. Now, if we have more resilience, would have towns and cities that would be able to sustain shocks better, such as with the increase of the sea level, with a pandemic or whatever. We would have cities and towns more well prepared to face extreme events. in a more foreseeable way. We have cities and towns that are spreading and expanding more and more, and this brings problems in terms of maintenance, conservation, and to take urban services in beyond, and there are social problems. We have towns and cities, for example, where the population is growing 4 times less than the consumption of the occupying of the land, so shall we say. So the spreading is not efficient. So we have sanitation, emissions, a series of problems that show that the development model that we have is not tenable. And in this scenario that was already known, that already had problems, we had on top of it all a pandemic. And we have many cities and towns affected by COVID-19. We have over 1 million people living in informal settlements in the world, over 2 billion people without access to drinking water and sanitation, and about 95% of cases in urban areas. Now, our living areas have never been as important and been on the front line as in COVID-19. So we see that cities and towns are now the main centers, pandemic centers, because of the concentration of people and activities that increase the rate of contamination and the risk of contamination. With COVID-19, we now understand the size, the dimension of globalization. We do, in fact, live in a world that is hyper-connected with a globalized infrastructure, and the trend is that problems will become more and more global. On the other hand, we have cities that are part of the solution. They take a major role in prevention, preparation, mitigation, and preparing for pandemics and future shocks. And it is urgent to think of emergency measures in a localized way, because we cannot not consider the needs of the populations that are more impacted. Now, we need to think of the resiliency in cities, new centralizations, how we can have more smaller centers instead of having just one large center, how we can improve access to services and the living spaces. Now, when we think of prevention, we need to think of water. We need to have water, daily, clean drinking water. We need money to buy soap, alcohol for sanitation, and we need a home where we can spend more time. What about people who live in a house where there are 5 to 7 people living in the same room? If one person is ill with COVID, how do you isolate them if you have teenagers and children in precarious living areas, perhaps homes made of wood without bathrooms? And we know that there are many people in this situation. Now, the pandemic exposes everyone. Without a doubt, we're all exposed to pandemics, but the possibility of defending ourselves and reacting is very different depending on where you are, the race and the gender of people. This has been said here, how Black people are dying more. And obviously, there is a report that is very interesting that makes an analysis in terms of inequalities during COVID in São Paulo, comparing factors of age. We have 2 towns, 23 kilometers apart, rather 2 neighborhoods in the São Paulo municipality. They're 23 kilometers apart, and the life expectancy in a rich neighborhood is 23 years more than the other neighborhood that's 23 kilometers away. This is very symbolic. Now, this is within the same municipality of São Paulo. Now, what does the crisis show us? It shows us that the many inequalities that we already face, well, the difficulties in dealing with a crisis does not affect everybody in the same way. The means of response differs. We have a very serious situation. The professors that spoke before showed data reflecting the seriousness of the situation, the drop in per capita income and the global income also falling. The dropout rate from schools, the highest since 1980, the highest higher mortality rate. And so this fact, in fact, is a crisis that affects everybody everywhere. So the pandemic is in risk for reaching the SDGs. All the SDGs are affected and they cannot be left behind. They're more urgent than ever because reaching the SDGs and the guidelines of the new urban agenda will mean a better town or city that can address a crisis. It is a human rights agenda, but it's also a strategic development agenda for countries. Now, to wrap up, what have we learned through COVID? What are the lessons learned? It might be premature to think of the different topics, but it is inevitable to try and reach some conclusions and some paths for analysis. Now, the first thing is connection. We have a world that is more connected than we thought, although countries have made efforts to close borders, restrict number of flights. We see the variants do spread and the virus spread at first, so the world is much more connected than we thought. There are different impacts in terms of different people. People do not respond in the same way. The impact is not the same. We see that there's inequality in that. This is something that we have to look at through a lens, a magnifying glass. We need to rethink our public spaces, our urban areas. We see how green areas are being becoming more and more important, and we see how towns and urban areas are changing. What has come to stay in terms of our urban areas, how the impact has affected our transport, and different spaces where we can walk. The need also to think of the economy and jobs and re-education. We need to rethink about and see what is here to stay, what new technologies are going to be taken up, what kind of schools, is there going to be greater inequality between schools, where there were schools that had better indicators and other schools that had lower indicators, lower marks. So we need to rethink the resiliency in our urban areas so that we can put up with future shocks. Others will come, be they pandemics, climate change shocks, be they connected to migratory processes, but other shocks will come. And a conclusion that we can reach is that no one is safe if we are not all safe. So that is the word of the Secretary General of the United Nations. And this is something that reflects what we've been living since last year. I would now like to thank you for the invitation once again, and thank you for allowing me to take part today, this afternoon. Thank you, Rayani, for showing us the UN Habitat view outlook in terms of the pandemic. So urban areas concentrate problems and solutions because towns and cities can become resilient. So now we're going to start with the questions, and I'm going to ask Professor Salama, and he'll be able to complement and add to his previous words. You mentioned a very interesting idea showing that a socialist government in Mexico and a liberal right-wing government in Brazil, that they reached different solutions, and they were even antagonistic in terms of the political perspective. Now, how come we can explain that the neoliberal Bolsonaro government managed in the first few months in emergency relief, managed to provide 50 million people give emergency relief in the first 3 months? And now, how do the initiatives taken up that don't sound as though they fit with a neoliberal government, how did they reflect the Gini drop? There was a drop in the Gini. Shouldn't these policies have improved the prospects for the poorer population?
Salama, precisa de voz.
Professor Salama, you're on mute. Please turn on your microphone. Oh, yes, I'm terribly sorry. Thank you very much. I don't think the Mexican government is socialist. I don't think so. What I said was that it's a nationalist government between inverted commas, and also they called itself a progressive government. It's not socialist. That's different. And secondly, I think, well, you know, AMLO was very high in his terms of popularity. His economic policy was rather orthodox, neoliberal, even to a certain extent. And he did nearly nothing to give support to poor people, or give support to poor people in the beginning of the crisis. Not last year. Today, yes. No. So what's interesting is that there isn't a mechanical relationship between what happens at the social level and the political level, and the economic level and the political level. What that means is that the relationships are rather complex, and in the case of Mexico, you need to think that of Mexico in its context, in its own context, and AMLO's fight against corruption. And every day he goes on television to speak against corruption. He also talks about that it's the national question, not the immigrant question, but Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, other countries. He used to speak against the Latin American organization of countries. Now, I think all this is important to understand the popularity, AMLO's popularity to this day in his own country, including the poor population. In the case of Brazil, there is a very different tendency, or tradition. Sulamis talked about health, and we know the country has very low public health system, and Mexico, well, has something, well, you can compare Mexico to Brazil in terms of health.
And in this way, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil have a strong role, quote unquote, in terms of having public health when compared to other countries, for example, Peru, the worst of all, or a country such as Mexico. There are other issues such as capitalization, etc., etc. Mexico's position is much more liberal. AMLO's politics is one of respecting the great macroeconomic equilibrium. But in the case of Brazil, effectively, there is, regulation, ceiling caps, for example, but there's always the possibility of negotiating all of this inside Congress as well, which is what happened with the emergency aid, which is that effectively there was an opportunity that came about through amendments and through other measures, so that this discussion was carried out and a significantly strong aid was created to prevent poverty from not completely increasing. It's going to increase, but it increased a bit less than it would have normally increased. The problem is that after the emergency aid, what happened effectively is that there was a significant increase in poverty and a significant decrease as well in Bolsonaro's popularity. So these are quite complex issues, in my opinion. What interests me in a certain way, and this is a mystery to me, I'm not absolutely sure what happens here, is, two things. The first thing is that the left, in my opinion, should be careful with a concept. I think in my country, for example, but not only my country, in many Latin American countries as well, the neoliberal concept is the main concept followed today since the end of World War II. But when this concept cannot explain the fact that in many countries, especially the advanced countries, had a very strong state intervention, which was not included in the neoliberal concept, then it's a problem. So you have a mixture of neoliberal model with interventionist model. So we need to think about a concept to understand what's going on and not wave a certain flag which says neoliberal means left. No, we need to look at what's happening, what's happening in the entire job market. What's the situation now with employment? Because in my opinion, there are implications on the ways in which poverty comes about, especially for Mexico, for example. Mexico did not have emergency aid or had very little, which means how are people going to survive during a period such as the period that occurred in the past, where there has been an increase, an 8-point increase of poverty, which was a lot for Mexico. But what does this mean exactly? There are possibilities to overcome this. In my opinion, from what I've learned in a way from emergency aid, is that you need two things. The first thing you need is to help a lot more the poor segments of the population, the lower income segments of the population, doing an entire tax reform, a huge tax revamp, much more significant than the ones that are being done today. Here in Brazil and Mexico, there are tax systems that actually are making rich people even richer. And this is even more so now than it was before, which is crazy, what I want to say is what I've learned from the emergency aid that happened in the open crisis of pandemic is that we absolutely need to have a aid policy. And also, we need to favor policies for education so that people can actually have the ability to work, they have the skills to work. In my opinion, this seems to be extremely important for us to know how to have a structural reform and also reform in education and in health, as you said very well. So this is what I've learned. If we, otherwise, the recovery of growth is not going to eliminate poverty. That's impossible. The only way to recover growth, but also fighting poverty, is to have structural reform so that the country can be an inclusive country, both socially as well as in climate issues. And this, to me, seems to be very important. And perhaps this is the most important lesson I've learned from the pandemic, from what happened in the pandemic, and not only in Latin America, but also in my own country. This is very important. We need, in my view, intellectually, to think of a new concept. We need to rethink what is the concept that we have to address to understand what happens in many countries during the pandemic, and above all, to get out of this pandemic. In the economic level and the social level, which is poverty, in, the employment level. We need to rethink of all of this. Economists are very much falling behind in this matter. This is my opinion. Excellent response, excellent answer, Professor Salama. Thank you so much. Celia, I have a question for you. You did a very interesting study showing of social politics, very original. My question is, Salama spoke of structural poverty and conjunctural poverty. Now, if we consider that during COVID, there was a concentration of income all over the world, and not only income concentration, wealth concentration, but for companies hold, an excessive amount of assets, how can we separate this worsening in Brazil from what is its structure and what is based on the international context currently? Thank you. Okay, so just to try to answer your question now, I think it's very hard to separate both things. Things are very mixed up, and I think what Sula brings in terms of a long COVID and in terms of public policies, we're going to have to deal with this for a long time in Brazil. We're going to have the residual effects of the pandemic, not only from the health care point of view, but also socially, we're going to have to deal with this for a while. And my issue is until which point this international context will not be at another point contributing to our structure, because these things end up creating new inequalities and perpetuate them for a while. So we need to pay attention to that. I want to talk about what Salama mentioned, which I think are very interesting. Do you allow me, Dali, just for a minute or so? Yeah, he called our attention to for the fact that we talk about neoliberalism as a very loose term, and I agree with him completely. I think the Brazilian case is interesting because what we're living in Brazil is a situation that I would call dementialism. It has to do with the sheer dementia of the situation and the lack of government that we're living through. This dementialism, we see during this emergency aid, a combination between a market fundamentalism that needs to be, that we have to hold back. We have to hold back. Paulo Guedes, our Minister of Finance, and something that has to do with our president that is looking at the next election. So how not to veto Congress's initiative and civil society's initiative of creating an important emergency aid had a lot to do with the election cycles, I think. However, we see already that these measures, which were both interesting and important, these redistribution policies, were already gained a new meaning, a different meaning from the market fundamentalist side of the government, which is trying to permanently transform measures that have to do with the job market. For example, making workdays more flexible, reducing wages, etc. So measures that were taken to reduce the poverty levels in an emergency situation, now they're trying to make these measures permanent because the side of the government that is market fundamentalist is trying to bring this into the agenda. Congress vetoed this. I don't know how this will unfold from now on, but this was a trick, and it was revealed, and it shows how our political soul still comes from a tradition of market fundamentalism. So yes, I would say that. Another thing that Salama raises is that the emergency aid shows how important redistributive policies are. It was very important. We would have had 8 GDP points reduced instead of 4 if we hadn't had the emergency aid. There's studies that show this. And the tax stimulus had an important role in this emergency aid by reducing the impact of the pandemic on the development of the GDP, which is an important impact. The second point also has to do with what Salama said of the work market, which is not only do we need to look at income and improve workers' income, and that's important in redistributive policies, but we also need to think of a development model that is more based on public services. education, healthcare, housing, transport. This has to be the core of the recovery because you're solving social needs, but you're also supplying and encouraging economic growth. And this is the thought that is lacking in the head of our economists. Question for Sulamis now. Today, there's a statistic that was published that life expectancy all over the world has decreased. At the same time, you've pointed out that COVID affected more the low-income populations and the sicker populations. Doesn't this affect the government's budget positively, since you have people living for less time, getting less pension funds? How does this affect the budget, since you're a budget expert? Well, when I saw this data in terms of life expectancy that reflect the world and Brazil situation, those who want pension fund reform and are saying that at some point retirement funds will be unpayable because the pyramid is going to be inverted. This argument is going to be completely dismantled because, in a way, from the point of view of the reform, you can... I'm sorry, there was a certain freeze of her audio and image. The problem is we're talking about life expectancy alone, but when you look at how COVID impacted different populations as well, in the European countries where you have an elderly population as well as in the US, and initially when we had no defense mechanism, the more elderly parts of the population died. But if we look at the African countries, if you look at Asia, Southeast Asia, if you also look at Brazil and Latin America, you will see that the pandemic became younger and it started affecting the population that is at the working age. And this came much later. So the demographic change has not been completely registered yet in terms of data, but certainly if younger people are getting sick with this disease with long-term effects, this will also negatively impact the economically active population. And this will have other consequences on the funding of pension funds. So this is all based in a model that is for pension funds that is contributive. So I think the future that awaits us would be more viable if we had a first basic level of social pension funds from the entire population. Because I think these demographic changes, I'm not sure how they're going to affect people. I think it's going to be more serious for people who are working than for those who are not. But I'd like to quickly add two things that seem to me very important. One, Salama touched upon something that he wrote in his article that I had the pleasure to read. That is the difference of perspectives in terms of growth policies for both Mexico and Brazil. He called our attention to the fact that Brazil is going through an effort of privatization that takes away our water and our energy and privatizes them. Privatization of health or financialization of health comes before COVID. This is also happening in education. So the international purchases by large educational groups. The fact of the infrastructure issue is being protected in the case of Mexico, and it's completely given away in the case of Brazil. And this is the moment in we are very original in terms of the economic health industrial complex that works by unifying the entire productive chain, thinking of technology, thinking of industrial policies and scientific policies in an integrated manner. And to me, the huge surprise at the moment, and Biden actually attacked poverty by supporting income and added demand through checks. But when he thinks about the future, he works with productive chains, not only in industry, but in the services sector, as Celia mentioned. So this, let's say, is a shift in paradigm that is very important, from which Brazil at the moment is completely completely out of. We can't just think of redistribution without growth, without a policy that can actually include and create skilled workers. But we need a project for that, and this project does not exist in Brazil. Okay, Raine, I'd like you to... There is a message of the UN General Secretary mentioning what you just said, which is important. Yes, Talia, when the pandemic started, the special former rapporteur of the UN on adequate housing said that housing became the front lines of defense against the coronavirus pandemic. Before, housing was not a life or death issue as it is at the moment, and housing became the core of the debate. And now housing is in the core of the new urban agenda strategy, inviting us to think about cities based on housing and not the other way around. So talking about adequate housing criteria and other things. Later, the General Subsecretary of Human Rights of the UN says that nobody is safe until everyone is safe. So, in fact, as I said in my presentation, this is a crisis, is a pandemic that affects all, but the ability to deal with it, to respond, to understand, and to protect oneself is completely different depending on where you live, on your family composition, on the color of your skin, and on your gender. We see inequalities being exacerbated. We see a lens shining on old problems that we knew very well, and we see the situation being aggravated. And I think on today's panel, somehow all presentations have collaborated towards this view. So as I said before, perhaps it's premature to reach certain conclusions, but at least some paths have been shown. Data, indicators, and information that have shown already and are starting to indicate a worsening in certain aspects and doubts in other aspects, and certainly opportunities in others. Everything in life has two sides, a negative and a positive, and I think with the pandemic we've been able to exercise more empathy and tolerance, and our solidarity and a feeling of team and community and neighborhood. So I think that we always learn something positive. In this moment, it hasn't been any different. I think some positive changes actually came to stay.
We spend more time with our families, we'll spend more time at home. Before, we had such an intense office life, and school life was very intense. But once again, it's too soon for us to reach conclusions. But I think that the future will not be easy. I think we will have a long path. It was long before. It will be long to reduce inequalities. There's an ODG 10 to reduce inequalities in the 2030 agenda, and that subject will not leave our agenda anytime soon. We're going to have to work on it with the different ways, thinking of the economic, the social aspects, and the territorial aspects, or the national aspects, and looking beyond the statistics. So, Professor Dalia, those are my final remarks. Thank you. Now, I'd like to thank the panel. Thank you to the SESC. In the morning, hunger and waste was broached. That subject was talked about, and our panel showed that poverty has increased, and the SESC RJ has a challenge, an even greater challenge in terms of hunger in Brazil, because we're going to have more people needing a meal. So I would like to have a round of applause for our panel. I think it was wonderful. We managed to look at different perspectives, and I'd like to thank everyone. And now I'd like to give the floor to Karen to close the session. Thank you very much, Professor Dalia, Professor Pierre, Raini, Sulamis, and Professor Celia. It was really a very good panel. Thank you very much for being with us. Now, we are closing the program for the first day, but we're going to carry on having a very high-level conversations, intelligent proposals, suggestions tomorrow. And we look forward to seeing you, and thank you for the comments in the chat. It's really important to see that you're following everything and taking part. We're going to have a session tomorrow as from 10 a.m. And thank you very much once again. See you tomorrow.
Ok, beijo, beijo.
Goodbye.
Tchau.
Goodbye, everyone.
Eu tenho fome de cidadania.
Eu tenho fome de ajudar.
Eu tenho fome de fazer a diferença.
Eu tenho fome de levar esperança. Eu tenho fome de inclusão.
O Mesa Brasil Sesc RJ agradece a todos que colaboram para que essa receita seja um sucesso diariamente. Juntos, adicionamos o nosso ingrediente mais importante, a solidariedade.
Tenho fome de brincar. Eu tenho fome de batata. Eu tenho fome de tomate. Eu tenho fome de feijão.